Well, thank you for being here. As I was sitting there watching our technical problems, and hi to everyone online who's watching us. I'm sure my mother's out there, along with my dad. I know for sure I've got at least those two fans guaranteed. My wife, not so much. She's seen me more often than not, so she's not worried about it. Um, when we were working with those technical problems, I was thinking, typical politicians, we're going to blame someone else for what's gone wrong and not take responsibility. So. Anyways, I am really glad to be here tonight with you and to joining people online too. A chance to introduce myself, to answer some questions. What I'm going to do is exactly what I do in town halls whenever I go across the country. A couple of you have been to ones I've been at in Burlington and Markham and a few places like that. I'm just going to talk a little bit about myself, what I'm doing, and then we'll do the question and answer, and we will try to be done. I'll try to be quicker than I normally am because I know we've got some time constraints with the broadcast and so forth. I'm very glad I'm here with you tonight, but I kind of would like to be with two other people tonight rather than you. As nice as you are, as wonderful as you are, my two inspirations for running for office are still in Ottawa tonight and not with me. I am very fortunate to be married to a lovely girl by the name of Gerald. Not exactly your normal Canadian name, girl Trost. I'll guarantee you she's the only one in the whole country. And I'm in a bit of a unique situation in that she encouraged me more to run and wanted me more to run than I did. And that leaves me in a very unique position compared to many of the other candidates. Because a lot of them, their wife, their spouse didn't want them to run as much. But you have to understand where my wife comes from. She grew up behind the Iron Curtain. She wasn't born in Canada, like I'm sure a few of you here. She immigrated. She was born somewhere else. She's one of those people who chose Canada and loves it passionately. But the country she grew up in was communist when she was first born. It was ruled effectively by the Russians. They were essentially a colony. And she actually understands what democracy means. She understands that democracy is not free. The price for freedom is very high. She saw the democracy movement in her own country, Mongolia. Her mom was actually, who now lives with us, was part of the democracy movement there, the fight for freedom. She's actually worked in the Mongolian parliament before she came over here on a scholarship and got her master's degree and worked. So when you've got someone like that behind you, of course you would love to be with her and love to be there. But she understands that if Canada is to be the country we want it to be, if Canada is to be the success, people have to give. People have to stand up. And that's why, as much as I would love to be with her tonight, and she would love to be with me, and we also have a really cute 2-year-old by the name of Isabel. Big brown eyes, the whole bit. I'm here tonight with you because I believe in something. There's two types of politicians in this world. The type of politician that is a weather vane, if you know what a weather vane is, one of those things on the top of a barn that points back and forth. And the type of a politician that's a compass. Someone who points in a true direction, somewhere where they know where they want to go. And I honestly had never thought about running for the Conservative Party leadership. A couple people had approached me. But last May at our party's convention in Vancouver, our party took a very sharp change in direction on one particular issue, on the traditional definition of marriage. Our party had always stood for that. It was in fact one of the things included in the founding negotiations between the Progressive Conservatives and the Canadian Alliance to actually make the party. It's something the MPs had asked to be included in the negotiations. How much it was, I don't exactly know, but I know MPs who said they insisted upon it being there. And when our party changed positions on that, I honestly didn't have as much a problem with the people who had always been on the other side of the issue. They had always argued against traditional marriage. But what caught me by surprise in Vancouver was when people who had been for that value, who had stood for the traditional family, all of a sudden decided to be like a weather vane, and they had pivoted completely over to the other side. And that, to me, I struggle with. I actually admire politicians, even ones I disagree with on the left, who have a clear direction, who know where they want to go, who absolutely stand for something and are willing to argue the point. I have more respect for those people than I do for the ones who go back and forth. And when I watched people in our party begin to go like weather vanes and change their opinions really quickly, I thought, this is wrong. We as the Conservative Party, we as Canadians need to know what we believe, we need to know where we're going, and we need to stick to our values. If we change, we need to do it in a principled fashion, we need to explain why we need to do it. But politics is not about doing what's the easiest thing. Politics is about what's doing the right thing. And that's what got me motivated and interested to be involved. Again, talking about my wife, we talk about political courage in Canada. Her former boss was a member of parliament in the Mongolian parliament who got her seat in a by-election because the original MP, the MP's older brother, was assassinated. So when Canadian politicians talk about courage, when they talk about standing to something, my wife shrugs her shoulders. Because she comes from a country where people stood up, where they fought for their freedom, where they protested in their streets, where they now have a democracy far from perfect. But where politicians do stand up and do what is right, they pay for it, not with just bad press, but with their lives. And I think that's the reason we as Conservatives need to get involved. We need to be there. We don't need to be wishy-washy weather vanes, not just on the marriage issue, but on a whole lot of other issues going forward. And so who is Brad Trost and what does he stand for? You get to ask a lot of questions later on, but let me give you sort of three basic general ideas to frame our discussion, our question and answer tonight. First of all, I'm a fiscal conservative. I believe that a government that can give you everything you want can take it all away. So when a government starts to spend and spend and spend, it's not money that's coming from some magic pot. It's coming from you. And so the government that continues to give you more and more can only give it if they take and take. So that means it doesn't matter what it is. Things like the carbon tax. You guys have versions of it here in Ontario. They call it cap and trade. It's all sort of, dressed up as good for you environmental. In a practical sense, you know it as that really high electrical bill that Kathleen Wynne has imposed upon you. Or it doesn't matter if it's higher income taxes, that then the money's being redistributed and sent, as it was yesterday, to fund $650 million of overseas abortions. Taxes like that are taking your money. It's not the government's money, it's your money. So as a fiscal conservative, I want to cut your income taxes, I want to cut business taxes, I want to keep payroll taxes down, I don't want a carbon tax, not just because it's good for the economy. It is. People prosper, people are more successful with lower tax rates, but because it's about freedom as well. Because when the government taxes, they control you. And when they control you, they can tell you what to do, and they can manipulate. So I'm a fiscal conservative. We can talk fiscal issues, my tax plans later on if you want to ask those sorts of questions. I'm also a social conservative. And I actually tie it in with my fiscal conservatism as well. Because if you do not have the family as the foundation of society, if you do not have a mom and a dad looking after their kids, the welfare state is going to go in that place and it's going to cost us all. And the role of the government is to protect human life. And human life, as we all know, begins at conception. It goes on, it's a biological fact. So as a social conservative, I believe it is imperative in our societies to defend the traditional definitions, to defend the traditional definition of marriage, to defend human life, to get involved in those issues. They have consequences, even if you don't think they involve you. They do, because we in a society work together, there's costs, there's things that we need to stand for and get involved. And we can talk about that and get involved, ask more questions about specifics. It's a very good thing for the Conservative Party to understand too. All issues are not about money, and that's why we need to address and be involved on social issues in a reasonable and solid way and deal with those questions which are fundamental to people's values in day-to-day. And finally, I'm a democratic conservative. If I'm Prime Minister, I'm not your president, I won't be your dictator. In the Westminster British parliamentary system, which we have here in Canada, I become first among equals. And that means Ottawa doesn't know best. It means your member of parliament, he or she, hopefully a conservative, will actually have to think for themselves. And sometimes that'll mean disagreeing with the prime minister. You need to have that. It's constructive. There's a proverb which says, in the multitude of many counselors, there is wisdom. And that's something we in the Conservative Party have forgotten on occasion. If you're party members, and I don't know how many of you currently are, you know that almost the only thing you get from party headquarters is a fundraising appeal. They want your money, but they don't always want your opinion. And that's wrong. The whole purpose of a political party is not for leadership at the top and then having people underneath working for them. It's for the leadership to be servants and to actually work on behalf of the values that the membership actually stand for and work for. And that's one of the things I think sometimes we've forgotten. So what's 100% conservative? What's a true conservative? It's someone who's fiscally conservative, someone who's socially conservative, and someone who's a democratic conservative. Now, I've given you a little bit about my background. You can ask a bit more how long I've been a member of parliament, what my critic roles are, or you can ask about policy and different things. I will try to be brief in my answers, but let's start the discussion. So who's got some questions? Again, doesn't matter what it's about.
And certainly, I have lots of questions to ask, but it's surprisingly not all about me. I'm looking for questions from the audience. If you have one, by all means, just put up your hand. I'll bring the microphone over. You can ask Brad the question. If not, I've got lots of questions that I'd like to ask.
I think we see a hand over there, Mike, so take it away, and I'll point and you run.
You say that your wife was pushing you towards running for the leader of the Conservative Party, but why did you become an MP originally?
I first became a member of parliament in 2004. And it was a really unique circumstance. There were some reasons which I don't want to get into publicly, but the previous Canadian Alliance member of parliament had to go his own way from the party. Nothing to do with me at all, had to do with an issue between him and the party. And the Conservative nomination was headed toward going to a gentleman who had been the Liberal candidate in a neighboring riding the year before, and anyone who was politically active had been a long-time New Democrat. If you were this high in Saskatchewan, you know the politics. He was famous in the city I lived in and so forth. And when I looked at the options, I looked at someone who was running as an independent and had some issues that, again, I don't need to discuss here. And I looked at someone who had just joined our party as an opportunist. Like, I'm all in favor of Liberals and New Democrats joining the Conservatives because they believe in the cause. But let's put it this way, he was both holding a Liberal and a Conservative membership at the same time. And I thought, I really don't want to have the option of voting for someone who doesn't believe in something. A lot of people get into politics and then they figure out what they believe. I've never had that problem. I've known what I've believed from day one. You look at all the history on the web of we. So that's why I got in, because I wanted someone to fight for what I believed in, and I wanted someone to stand up for it. And we were supposed to lose the seat. Jason Kenney, the former cabinet minister, donated $1,000, and he said, frankly, Brad, we thought you were going to lose. We weren't going to put more money behind you, but we wanted to support you. But we won. Again, there was a bit of an odd vote split and things. But that's why I got involved, because somebody needed to stand up for what they believed in rather than just someone taking the job because it was available. Okay, next question. The gentleman back there. Go back there, Mike, and run, run, run. If you do it fast enough, we'll work you at Wimbledon next year.
Brad, I agree with your three principles, which is the physical conservative, democratic conservative, and social conservative.
Fiscal, social, and democratic
Good.
conservative. And let's just check with my video guys. Are you guys getting that for the broadcast? Good stuff. Keep going.
But right now, on Sunday, I was at Kevin O'Leary's meeting. What he was telling is that we need, I quite agree with you on the marriage is fundamentals. We can't just deviate. But Kevin was saying that if we stick to that, we won't be able to win an election, especially majority government, to form a majority government. So could you tell me, how will you, with these principles, which I admire, you will lead to a victory?
Yeah, let me just say this about Kevin O'Leary. This is the first time he's ever run for office in anything. He doesn't go out there and door knock. Like if you're talking to a regular member of parliament, we knock on thousands of doors and actually talk to people. He hasn't actually done that. So I take a little bit skepticism there. But let me say this. A fair number of you here are like my wife. You'd be considered visible minorities, okay? Most of you would be socially conservative. We know new Canadians are overwhelmingly socially conservative. Of the 33 ridings in Canada where visible minorities are the majority, only 2 are represented by conservatives. I will guarantee you all 33 of those ridings are socially conservative in their values. You look at when they had the issue, and still have the issue, of the sex ed curriculum here in Ontario. Scarborough and places like that were the most vehemently opposed to the new education being put in. So what Kevin O'Leary is saying, and others like him, that we just run on issues that are economics. We just appeal to wealthy ridings at that point. We don't appeal to the majority of the ridings, which are below the lower incomes. We just target upper class wealthy ridings. And if you're only going to campaign on economic issues, that's by and large where you're going to go. So frankly, if you look in Atlantic Canada, they're not economically the most conservative. If you look at the visible minority ridings, if you look at rural Western Canada, social issues matter. You have to talk both economics and you have to talk social issues. You have to talk about issues like crime and justice. You have to talk about what people's family values are. Those things actually win. In 2006, 2008, the Conservative Party actually ran on the traditional definition of marriage, and the polling data was clear. The Liberals lost seats all over the place on it. So historically, I appreciate what Mr. O'Leary is saying, but he's wrong. There's more to life than just money. Money matters, and I know to Mr. O'Leary, money's probably the only thing that matters, but not to everyone else. To me, the most precious thing in my world is a 2-year-old little girl by the name of Isabel. Yes, I need a good job to pay for her. Yes, I'm worried about paying for her university someday, but there's more to life than just money, and that's why I disagree with him, and frankly, why most Canadians do too. Okay, next question.
Just, Brad, if I could, technology's working really well, and we're starting to get some questions online. Stephanie from Manotick sent in a question about M103. And she's very concerned with your stand on M103 because she says the purpose of the motion is to protect Muslims, and why would you be opposed to that?
Okay, the question was about M103, what's known as the Islamophobia motion. Like most people, not most people, like all members of the House of Commons, I have fought for religious freedom. I fought for Muslim minorities' religious freedom, the Baha'i, Christian groups around the world, and I am a very strong, unapologetic supporter of religious freedom. But this M103 motion asks us to condemn all forms of Islamophobia. And using the Oxford English Dictionary definition, not some made-up definition, Islamophobia is criticism of all forms of Islam, including political Islam. Okay? I don't have a problem if you criticize my religion. I'm a Christian. Okay? That's the background I come from. That's my faith. I'm sure there's different ones. I'm sure probably majority here people are Christian. Maybe you belong to no religion. But we in Canada need to have the right to be able to criticize, to debate, and to go back and forth. If the motion was to call for the religious protection not only of Muslims, but of everyone else, Christians, Jews, Buddhists, etc., all in favor of it. Look, our critic, who's one of the most strongly opposed people opposed to M103, he was in Myanmar, Burma, fighting for the religious minority rights of Muslims, something the Liberals didn't tell you. That's one of the people who's fighting this. Because the Islamophobia motion was about shutting down criticism and the government then putting together a committee which would come back with recommendations that would again tell people how to think, and what to do. And that's the thing. Feel free to criticize Brad Trost. Feel free to criticize Brad Trost's religion. But the same thing goes for other people. We need to have discussion on this, and this motion was just going to shut down debate on legitimate foreign policy issues and legitimate immigration issues. Look, I had probably 24 volunteers from different denominations of Islam work on my campaign. A lot of them don't have problems with people taking criticism. It's only the extremists who get worked up about a little bit of criticism. And we in Canada, we can criticize back and forth, and that's not a problem. That's why I'm opposed to M103.
Okay, and let's take a question from the room. Sir?
I'm going to have to be shorter on my answers if we're going to get through this. Sorry.
Okay, love your brochure on promoting safety and security. So let's be specific. What about promoting Canadian aviation? Strengthen the Royal Canadian Air Force for security. Stop cross-border tourists going to the States. Why not keep Canadian airports open to create jobs? How about having that specifically as promoting safety and security?
So you got that? I'll say two things very quickly here. Our Air Force is too small and under-equipped. No if, and, but, or maybe about it. The government also puts too many taxes, fees, backdoor rents, etc. on our airports, and that is driving jobs south. That's killing jobs in Montreal and moving them to Plattsburgh. That's killing jobs in Windsor and moving them to Detroit, Vancouver, across. We need to quit taxing, regulating, and nickel and diming with fees our airports. Look, Canadians love to fly. The problem is the government makes it more expensive than it should. So those are two good ideas.
Okay.
You mentioned earlier that life begins at conception, and most of us take that as a biological, obvious statement. And we also know that Canada, along with China and North Korea, has no limits of any sort on abortion. And there was also, if I'm not mistaken, a motion that was voted on at Parliament. And my question is, why did those people who voted against it find such a motion so dangerous to just basically have a statement as, when does life begin in a legal sense?
I think what you're referring to is in the previous Parliament, a motion by a member of Parliament named Stephen Woodworth. It's a good question, okay? Basically, it was a motion to ask about having a study about when human life begins, not biologically, but legally, because we know when it begins legally. I don't know. I honestly don't know. I do know I was a part of the majority of the government, the Conservative Party, the majority of the MPs, voted to say, hey, this is something that we need to talk about and we need to look into. Because as you said, Canada is we are the only democracy and one of only a handful of countries in the world that have no legislation dealing with human life in almost no circumstance before birth. And that makes us strange, that makes us weird, and it causes some real problems in the law. So I've proposed some concrete things which are actual current Conservative Party policy, the implementation as a government bill, the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, also known as Molly and Cassie's law. There's different versions of it. And also the Conservative Party at its last convention and its previous convention put a position opposing gender selection abortion. Those would be government bills. That's Conservative Party policy. On top of that, I think what we need to do is also educate people and change their minds so that later on in the future we can begin to think about legislative steps. And to do that, my health minister under a Brad Trost Conservative government would get funding and a mandate to promote the value of human life. Example I've given, to go out there and educate people on the value of people that have Down syndrome. Because in our society, if you have a diagnosis that your baby is going to have Down syndrome, you're often pushed to have an abortion. So people like that are being treated as second-class citizens in our society and being told you're not valuable. I would change that. Now that's just an example. My health minister would be instructed to use that as a principle to figure out ways to help women who are in what they call crisis pregnancies, to encourage them to make a positive choice for life.
Okay, can we do one quick one online before we go
Okay,
back
if you
to
got
the-
another one online, we'll do it quickly.
Absolutely. It's Ian from Markham, and he says, as a gay man in a committed relationship for 5 years, he wants to know if you would stop his ability to marry his partner.
I am very much a strong proponent of traditional marriage. And I understand not everyone agrees or shares that opinion, okay? We voted on it in the House of Commons, and I'll be honest, as much as I don't like it, I don't see any realistic prospect right now of changing that legislation. And as this gentleman has rightfully pointed out, when you change something like this, you're going to have all sorts of complications. So what I'm talking about, and what my suggestion is not to change the law for him, but to actually provide protections so people who have different views, people like myself who believe in the traditional definition, they will be protected as far as their children's education. If you want to teach your children that the only appropriate sexual relations are between a man and a woman who are married, you should have that right in law not to have other views forced upon your children when they go to school. I'd also seek to promote protections. Like, it's basic parental rights. Mom and dad teach morality. The government doesn't teach morality, okay? When the state does, you have all sorts of problems. Other situations would be like, there are places where you can get discriminated against. I've heard civil servants say if they don't have the right views, had a federal civil servant bring this up to me this week on their, what was the term now, on their gender diversity awareness training and things like that. Look, Canadians should have the right to have different views on things like that and not be threatened of losing their job at the civil service. Or the Trinity Western University, where they were being blocked from having a law school because they want to teach traditional Christian morality to their students. And their students, who are adults, signed on a piece of paper coming in that they voluntarily agreed to these standards. And yet people in that situation, even with their own voluntary wanting to agree with those standards, are not being permitted to live and function. They're being treated as second-class citizens. So, to the gentleman there, I'm not going to pass legislation to change your situation, but I'm going to make sure that people, like the majority in this room, judging by the applause, that you aren't discriminated against, that your children aren't taught things that you are opposed to, and that you can agree to disagree. It's the same similar principle as talking with M103. Canadians need to be able to disagree and not have an official state-sanctioned thinking process on a whole range of issues.
Okay, somebody from the room there. So many hands up. Madam, it's all been gentlemen so far, so I'll come see you.
Hi, my name is Mary. Hi, I learned about you as a candidate from Campaign Life Coalition because they support you in your life and your beliefs in being pro-life and against abortion. I'm wondering if you got elected as Prime Minister, would you be able to defund abortion? Like, I know you're talking earlier, but would you be able to defund abortion or make it where it's not as accessible, or what else would you do for that?
Yeah, I'll answer that in two things. When it comes to provincial, and did you hear that? Would a Conservative Prime Minister be able to defund abortion? Healthcare is actually provided by the provinces. And this is something which your provincial politicians really won't tell you. They can actually defund abortion now. Now, with the current Liberals, they would probably take them to court and try to fight over it. The previous Conservative government, when we took over in 2006, the Liberals were trying to make the New Brunswick government pay for all abortions in New Brunswick, the Morgentaler clinics and so forth. Trying to remember who the health minister was. The Conservatives dropped the court case, and for years, until they got a different premier in New Brunswick had a fairly limited who could and could not get an abortion paid for. So provincial governments can already defund if they want, okay? The provincial politicians just often give excuses to say they can't. Now, when we were in the government, I led a campaign to get overseas funding for abortion eliminated. It took a few years to convince Stephen Harper and the cabinet ministers, but eventually we got to that point, and we implemented exactly what they have in the United States. They call it the Mexico City policy in the United States. We actually had that in Canada where, and this is interesting because even MPs in our caucus who weren't pro-life agreed with me on this point, that if we're going to put any money overseas, none of it should go to abortion. It should go to safe water. It should go to vitamins. It should go to helping maternal hospitals. It should go to all sorts of things that aren't controversial. Now, just this last few days, the Liberals decided they needed to spend $650 million of Canadian taxpayers' dollars. You know, the carbon tax is going to have to pay for something, to go fund abortions overseas. And you don't have to be pro-life like you and I are to understand that as a complete and total and utter waste of Canadian taxpayers' money. And yes, I stopped it once when I was a backbencher with a lot of help, and I would do it again as Prime Minister.
Okay, just another quick one from online. Rachel here in Toronto has a question about your CBC private members bill. Rachel says, the CBC is very important for Canadian culture and provides services to remote access areas that don't have access to other forms of television and radio. Why are you looking to eliminate the CBC?
I'm looking to privatize the CBC for a couple basic reasons. Number one, it costs Canadian taxpayers $1 billion a year and only promotes certain Canadians' views. Number two, a private CBC can actually deliver the services that people want. There are a few things which, when you look at it, the CBC is actually popular at. Very, very few. Most things they aren't. But for remote areas, for rural areas, for different regional sort of small broadcasts, nowadays with the technology, I mean, look what we're doing here online. This is my own television studio here tonight. We've got a couple computers and that. So a lot of these things can be done without $1 billion of Canadian taxpayers' subsidies, okay? Because when we just saved $1.7 billion tonight between overseas abortion funding and eliminating the CBC, I mean, I guess it's over 3 years. So we're about $1.5 billion a year we've just saved Canadian taxpayers tonight, okay? Between abortion and the CBC. I mean, look, the millennial generation, you know, Netflix and all sorts of stuff. My daughter who watches Peppa Pig online, she doesn't know what TV is. She thinks TV is something you can always push and move and swipe and go onto YouTube. It's with the million channel universe, let people have freedom to do their own broadcasts, because here's the thing, if you're a Canadian who wants to have your own vision out there and you have to compete against a program that's subsidized by millions of dollars by the CBC, it's unfair. So regional broadcasts, language minority broadcasts, those are all done right now by community services, and they could be done just as effectively without the $1 billion subsidy. So the CBC will exist, but they'll have to pay their own way if I become Prime Minister.
Okay, a question from the room. Sir in the front row.
As a leader, how would you balance the different voices within the party and lead the party to the right direction?
Okay, good question. How would I balance the party's different voices? Here's one thing you realize when voters vote Conservative. They vote Conservative because of things we are different than the Liberals, not because of the things we're the same as the Liberals. Think about that. That's something you understand about. We're different than the Liberals on fiscal policy. So the people who are fiscal conservatives, that's their number one issue. Maybe they're socially liberal, but they're most interested in the fiscal policies. Atlantic Canada, some parts of other rural areas, we often have very socially conservative conservatives who maybe because they're lower income or so forth aren't all that interested in tax cuts. They're there because they're social, cultural conservatives. Western Canada, we used to get a lot of votes because of the gun registry. So people vote for us because of what we do that's conservative, which actually means if you're an across-the-board conservative on all the issues, you have something you can relate to on each and every faction of the party. It's one of the things I found in my riding association in Saskatoon. I have 30 members on my board, the full complement. They span the complete ideological spectrum of the party. I've got a guy who's a complete and total libertarian, big fan of mine. I'll be his first vote, I'm pretty sure. Maxime Bernier, his second. I've got former progressive conservative candidate who's been my campaign chair. I've got people who are pro-life activists. I've got everything on that board, small businessmen, though, you know, the guy made pretty good money, so I don't know if he's that small businessman. I've got everyone, but they're there, not in spite of me being a full spectrum conservative, but because whatever it is that draws them to the party, as someone who's quite conservative, I can connect with them on that issue. And that's what actually makes it easier for someone who's more conservative in the party, because I don't overlap with the Liberals. So whatever your key issue is, that's the one where I tend to be philosophically in sync with you. Does it make sense? If not, we'll chat later. So, okay.
Okay, so Manuel from Kingston has a question about climate change. He says you're very vocal in your opposition to a carbon tax. If not a carbon tax, what is your solution for global warming?
I didn't put this in my resume, but by professional training, I'm a geophysicist. Went to school, one of my professors is a sedimentology professor, and he's very critical about the theory of man-made climate change. He wasn't the first person, but he's one of the people who's got me interested in the subject. And I would be considered someone who doesn't view man-made climate change as a serious substantive problem. You know, climate changes all the time, but it's more natural than man-made. And so instead of concentrating on eliminating carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, we should concentrate and take our environmental spending to handle things like dumping raw sewage into the St. Lawrence, the Ottawa rivers. It happens all across the country. We have abandoned oil wells in Saskatchewan. So, no war on oil and gas, no war on consumers by jacking up your hydro bills, because that's what these environmental carbon taxes are. You're paying for them in your electricity, okay? So no war on oil and gas, no war on consumers trying to just pay for their bills, no war on jobs, no war on farmers. That's what all these carbon taxes are. And instead of having regulations take away your jobs or backdoor taxes, I'm going to deal with other environmental issues, and we're just going to let the economy grow. So for me, it's not a problem. And guess what? That's the same approach they're taking now in the United States. And if we don't take the similar approach, we're going to see our jobs start to go south. And it's real fun to talk about, for environmentalists to talk about solving the world's problems. But if you lose your job, your problems have just started. And my position, and I'm the one candidate in the race who actually has a background that relates to this subject, my position is one which I'm very comfortable with scientifically. There's an irony. The geophysicist in the race is the climate skeptic. The candidate who, well, very smart guy, doesn't have a university degree is the one that's convinced that it's the biggest problem. So that's the perspective I come from. For those of you who are interested, Dr. Roy Barton, formerly of NASA with the University of Alabama, retired professor of atmospheric physics, Dr. Judith Curry, people like that, Dr. Ed Ball, not Ed Ball, different professor, I got the wrong name there. Tim Ball. Ed Ball's a Labour politician in Great Britain. Those sorts of people right on the web, easy for you to understand the science. My former professor in Saskatchewan, Brian Pratt, does a few things like that too. Pay attention to us. My view is scientifically solid. Okay. Mike, there's...
Hi, Brad.
Oh, there we are. Sorry.
That's okay. How will you ensure that pipelines get approved quicker, especially with regards to Aboriginal legal challenges in the court system?
Here's something I'm not sure if you knew. When the Conservatives were in power, there were 4 major pipelines that were built, developed, finished, and delivered, okay? People talk about the Keystone XL, where XL stands for extra large. But the original Keystone pipeline, 3 other pipelines, one called the Clipper, were all built. Pipelines get built, you just have to follow the rule of law. But what happened for the Conservative government in the last couple years of their mandate is we began to spend political energy on things like the Mike Duffy financial issue that ended up being in a trial. So when you start to spend political capital on some issues, it gets harder for you to actually sell the issues that really matter to Canadians, the economic ones. People tune out. When you're doing the small things wrong, when people feel you aren't listening, it's harder to get things done. So legally, there's no impediments to getting these pipelines built. 4 of them got built. It becomes a question of political credibility. And when people are unhappy about you on some issues, when they don't trust you on some issues, they're not going to give you the benefit of the doubt on things like pipelines. So if they think, well, he sort of fibbed to me about this, I no longer trust him, he's a control freak, I don't like him anymore, that gets to be harder. So what we need to do as conservatives is concentrate on issues, be honest with people when we make mistakes or when one of our own does something that maybe isn't right, and that will give us the credibility to deal with tough issues or deal with other things going forward. Because here's another little secret a lot of people don't know. A lot of these people in these areas, Aboriginal communities, really want the jobs, really want to be involved. I come from Saskatchewan, and I've worked in the mining industry. In Saskatchewan, there was this protest that was going to stop mine workers going to one of the mines. And it was Aboriginal protest, but the workers were all Aboriginal. The protest dissolved in about 20, 30 minutes. They were going through, they were going to work. People want to work. Aboriginal Canadians are no different than any other Canadians. They want to work, they just want to be worked with. So we've done it before, I think we can do it again.
Okay, so many questions in the room, sir.
Thanks. Brad, when we repatriated the Constitution in Canada, the Conservative premiers built in a conservative trump card called the notwithstanding clause, and I was really pleased when you brought it up, first of all the candidates, that I'd like you to address, well, first of all, how you can better articulate that to the layman who doesn't even know what it means, how that's a great thing that conservative governments should be using, and maybe give an example or two where it could have been used under the Harper government but wasn't.
Okay, quick thing. 1982, Canada's Constitution's coming back. A lot of our premiers are brought up in the Westminster parliamentary tradition, mostly conservatives, but Alan Blakeney, NDP from Saskatchewan, also agreed with this. And they saw the United States where the courts would override the legislature. They said, no, that's not our British Westminster tradition. What do we do if we bring in a constitution? So they introduced something called the notwithstanding clause, that can, not for everything, but for a lot of issues, overrule Supreme Court decisions and say the law of Parliament takes precedent over the court's decision. Okay? This gentleman here noted that I've been publicly strongly in favor of that, and I am strongly in favor of that because of this. The whole idea behind the notwithstanding clause is this. You, the people of Canada, are the ultimate deciders, not the Supreme Court. Supreme Court will give its opinion, but the country works for Canadians because ultimately our country is moral and just, not because 9 men and women on the Supreme Court make a decision, but because we as Canadians actually believe in justice for our other Canadians, and we as Canadians collectively can decide that. So that's why I'm a big fan of what's known as the notwithstanding clause, and I have said, if I am Prime Minister, I am going to argue for whatever criminal justice legislation I put forward. It'll be just and fair and right. And that means I'm willing to put it to the voters, and I'm willing to attach the notwithstanding clause literally to any justice legislation that my conservative government would put forward. There's been examples of some of the minimum sentencing laws in regard to sex offenders. There's been a few cases in the press where people have done crimes and you wonder why they're getting less than a year in prison. I think some of those laws where there would have been higher standards set for criminals to be sentenced, those would have been perfect places to put the notwithstanding clause in, and they should be used for that.
When you guys put in minimum sentencing and the judges basically threw that in the garbage, would that be
That would be an example. But I'm not so much looking back as I'm saying what I would do going forward. I think Prime Minister Harper should have looked at a few of those. Sometimes, though, only parts of the law were struck down and not the entirety. So, sounds like we got a freight train coming through here. So, okay, we've got a couple more minutes. So, Mike, figure out.
Hi. I'm a mother of 2 young children, raising my kids here in Ontario, and over the past few months, A few of the provincial bills here in Ontario have me quite concerned, Bill 28 and Bill 89 more recently. I also heard recently about your parental bill of rights, and I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more what kind of protections that would give me as a parent and for parents all across Canada, but specifically how that would translate here in the province of Ontario.
When you send your kids to school, you don't send them there to get a philosophy of life, a theology, or a political ideology, okay? That's your job as parents. You send them to school to learn how to do math, to learn how to do geography, to learn how to spell, because I can't spell, my kids are going to have someone else teach them. It's things like that. And because the federal government has the right to protect people's civil liberties, I've proposed the idea of a parental bill of rights. Things that used to be commonly understood under British common law, that parents were responsible for, that parents had the right to be responsible for, would be codified in law so that the government can't insist what philosophy your children are taught, so that you don't be discriminated against in dealing with your children. So a couple examples that this would provide protection. The sex ed laws here in Ontario. You could have the right to pull your child out if they were against your morals. Some people have said, would it just be for religious people? No. If you don't have to have religious views. If you feel it's inappropriate for your 6-year-old or your 8-year-old or 9-year-old to be learning about certain things, the school would not have the power to punish you or your child. You could pull it out. That would be your civil liberty or right to be protected. That's just one example. The other day I was hearing about the Children's Aid Society is now being empowered to take away children. And the issue is regarding the issue of transgender, and if the child wants to, has gender, I forget the term for it, gender confusion. And if the parents would refuse to support that and not encourage that, Children's Aid Society to be interfere, okay? That's none of their business, okay? You're trying to do the most helpful and kind thing with your child. I mean, as one example that was given was a little girl has a little baby brother born. He's getting all the attention, she's not. All of a sudden she decides, oh, I want to be a boy just to get attention. Any parent can figure that out. So for things like that, you don't need the Children's Aid Society. So that would be another example of where you would be protected on your rights. There's some forms of discipline, not abuse, discipline, that the government may want to interfere with, okay? We have laws to block forms of abuse. Things like that, parental rights would be protected. Be fairly explicit, and it would provide what should have been and what has been viewed as common law protections for years. So.
Okay, we've got time for a couple of more questions.
He's the guy to talk to.
Just wondered how you're going to do what's your first priority other than cutting the tax? Like how do you help the booming the economy here, like helping people with a job, and how do you booming the Canadian economy other than cutting the tax?
Yeah, when you form government, you can actually introduce multiple pieces of legislation. So I would say on the economics, because you're asking about taxes, I would say we have 3 basic economic priorities right now. They might change slightly over the next 2 years, but I suspect they'd be the same. First of all, major comprehensive tax reform. That's one way you can boost and grow the Canadian economy. Second, we have talked about having interprovincial free trade in Canada for years. It's easier to sell some of our products to Europe with the new free trade agreement, or to, who else did we just do one with? Colombia, Mexico, than it is inside Canada. So the federal government needs to be prepared to say to the provinces, you won't get what you want until you actually play fair with each other and allow Canadians to trade from coast to coast. And the third economic priority, relationship with the United States. It is wise and prudent for Canada to diversify its trading with as many other countries in the world as possible. But the United States is 300 million people, as our next door neighbor, with a lot of money, and even at their worst, they're still one of the richest countries in the world. We have to make that our #1 economic priority. It's not a matter of choice, it's a matter of absolute survival, particularly for the manufacturing sector here in Southern Ontario. So that would be 1, 2, 3, number 1 economic priorities.
So Brad, we've got to wrap things up there. If you want to say a few closing remarks, and then I'll close everything up. And for those of you who still have questions in the room, we can take questions afterwards. But if you say a few closing remarks, mostly for the people online, and then we'll wrap things up.
Okay, to my friends online, thank you for tuning in. We didn't know how this would work, but we want to give everyone an opportunity, and we will do this again, to be able to put questions to me, to be able to see who I am, because this is a vast country. I'm asking for your support. Go to my website in English, bradforleader.ca. Si vous préférez le français, votez bradtrost.ca and sign up. Encourage a friend. Democracy matters. This is one of the most important votes in Canada for the next Prime Minister. The next Prime Minister, the next election will either be Liberal or Conservative. You don't want to wait until Election Day to make that decision. You want to have some input. So if you agree with me that it's important to have a full Conservative, someone who is strongly fiscally conservative, prepared to say, hey, we need to cut expenses so we can cut taxes, you need to vote for me. If you want someone who is socially conservative, who, while respecting differences and diversity in the country, wants to promote traditional values, to protect traditional Canadian values and let minorities, who used to be majorities, to live their way of life, to promote the value of human life from conception forward, consider and get involved and vote for me. And if you support the democratic idea of conservatism, that party members should have views, they should be regularly consulted, they should have internal party votes and referendums on issues, and you want a democratic conservative, sign up. Anyways, thank you for participating online. Please sign up. We can use donations. There's generous tax credits, again at the same website. Remember to buy your membership, and please help us out with our campaign. We appreciate your support. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brad, very much for taking the time. And just to wrap things up, this is a very important process. This is not just a process by which the next leader of the Conservative Party will be chosen, but this is to really choose potentially the next person to be Prime Minister. So if you've seen something you're interested in here this evening, if you're interested in the process, go to bradforleader.ca and get a party membership if you haven't already got one. And also, leadership campaigns cost money, so same website. If you can make a small donation even, that'd be very much appreciated to help us keep the train on the tracks. We will do this again. We've got the technology pretty much worked out, and it's going to make it easier to do a second time. And on behalf of Brad and the entire campaign team, thank you all so much for taking part, and we'll see you again soon.